Today we're going to dive into 7 chilling horror stories, all involving cold, snow-covered nights, based on true accounts that will leave you breathless. Get ready to feel the ice on your spine as we explore these spooky mysteries. And before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any dark content like this. Now turn off the lights and let's go. 1. The Call of the Frozen Forest. In the remote village of Frosthaven, situated in the icy vastness of northern Norway, winter was not just a season, but a constant and relentless presence. The biting cold, the howling winds, and the days that seemed like eternal nights shaped not only the environment, but also the people who lived there. Isolated from the rest of the world, the residents of Frosthaven shared stories to fill the long, dark nights. The most famous of these was the legend of the Voice of the Snow. They said that on the coldest nights of the year, when the wind blew like a lament and the forest seemed alive, a sweet, melancholy voice echoed among the frozen trees. Those who heard the call and dared to follow the sound never returned. Some believed it was the work of ancient spirits, guardians of the forest. Others whispered that it was a curse cast by a woman betrayed centuries ago, condemned to wander through eternity. But there were also those who laughed at the story, calling it a childish superstition created to keep people away from the treacherous forest. Ethan was one of those skeptics. At 27, he had grown up hearing the stories around the fireplace, but had never believed them. For him, everything had a logical explanation. As an experienced hunter, he knew every corner of the forest and knew that the real danger came from the relentless cold and hungry predators, not from ghostly voices. But everything changed on a particularly frosty January night. The thermometer showed temperatures below any recent record, and the wind seemed intent on ripping the roof tiles off the houses. Ethan was in his hut, sharpening his arrows in the dim light of a lamp, when he heard something that made his heart stop for an instant. It was a whisper. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the wind, but it soon became as clear as crystal water. "Come!" He raised his head abruptly, frowning. The sound seemed to be coming from outside, but there was no one out there at that hour. It would be suicide to face that cold for no reason. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself that it was just his imagination playing tricks due to tiredness. But then he heard it again. "Come, find me." The tone was sweet and mesmerizing, as if each word was a melody designed to soothe and attract at the same time. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine, but it wasn't just because of the cold. There was something about it, something he couldn't explain. Against common sense and the warnings of the village elders, Ethan decided to investigate. He put on his warmest clothes, grabbed his bow and an oil lantern, and went out into the freezing night. The snow crunched under his boots as he walked towards the frozen forest. The whisper seemed to guide him, becoming clearer with every step he took. The forest was different that night. The ice-covered trees glistened in the light of the full moon, as if they were made of pure crystal. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional sound of the wind, and that voice. Ethan felt inexplicably drawn to it. It was as if something inside him was being pulled by an invisible thread towards the unknown. After walking for almost an hour in the deep snow, he came to a clearing he had never seen before, which was strange, considering he knew this forest like the back of his hand. In the center of the clearing stood she, a woman of unearthly beauty. Her skin was translucent as ice. Her long hair seemed to be made of pure snow. Her eyes shone with an ethereal blue that seemed to pierce Ethan's soul. She smiled at him, a smile that was both enchanting and disturbing, and spoke in a voice as soft as the whisper that had guided him there. "You came." Ethan tried to say something in response, but the words died in his throat. He was hypnotized by her presence, unable to look away or even think clearly. The woman held out her hand to him. Her fingers were as thin and delicate as sculptures made of crystalline ice. "I've been waiting for you," she said as she slowly approached. Ethan felt his body freeze, not from the cold around him, but from something much deeper and more terrifying. Pure fear mixed with uncontrollable fascination. When she touched his hand with her deathly cold fingers, an intense chill invaded his entire body. It was as if his very essence was being torn from him. He tried to resist, but it was useless. He was completely at her mercy. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was her smile, turning into something dark and predatory. The next morning, the villagers found only footprints in the snow. Footprints that led into the heart of the forest and abruptly disappeared into the clearing where Ethan had last been seen. There was no sign of him or what might have happened. The story quickly spread through the village like wildfire through a dry summer bush, if Frosthaven ever had one. Some said that Ethan had fallen victim to the voice of the snow. Others believed that he had simply gotten lost in the deadly storm that night. But the elders knew the truth. Ethan was now part of the frozen forest. Since that fateful night, it is said that the trees in the clearing where he disappeared have a peculiar glow under the light of the full moon, an ethereal blue glow similar to the eyes of that mysterious woman. And if you listen carefully during the coldest nights of the year, you can hear a distant whisper echoing through the forest. "Come." 2. The hut in the dark valley. The snow fell incessantly, covering everything in a white, suffocating blanket. The wind howled like a wild beast, and the group of friends, Sarah, Daniel, Emily, and Lucas, struggled to make their way along the invisible trail that disappeared beneath the storm. They had planned a trip to explore the mountains of Iceland, but nature had other plans. The blizzard had taken them by surprise, and now they were lost in an isolated valley, surrounded by cliffs and frozen trees. "We need to find shelter!" shouted Daniel, his voice almost swallowed up by the roar of the wind. It was then that Emily spotted something in the distance, a solitary hut, almost hidden among the ice-covered trees. The structure looked old and abandoned, with worn boards and windows covered in a thick layer of snow. With no alternative, they decided to take shelter there until the storm passed. As they entered the hut, the heavy, icy air seemed to carry more than just cold. The interior was dark, lit only by the dim light that penetrated through the frosted windows. There was old furniture covered in dust and a strange smell in the air, a mixture of rotting wood and something metallic. "It's better than dying out there," said Lucas, trying to sound optimistic as he closed the door against the biting wind. But it didn't take long for them to realize that something was wrong. Sarah was the first to notice. "Did you see that?" Something came through the window. Everyone turned to look, but there was nothing but darkness outside. Daniel laughed nervously. "It must have been your imagination." But then it happened again. A shadow passed quickly by the nearest window, as if something or someone was circling the hut. A tense silence overtook the group as each one looked at the others for confirmation that they weren't going mad. "Maybe it's an animal," suggested Emily, although her voice betrayed the growing fear inside her. They decided to light the fire to ward off the cold and brighten up the gloomy room. While Lucas tried to get the fire going, Sarah began to explore the hut in search of supplies or anything useful. It was then that she found a dusty diary on a table in the corner of the room. The pages were stained and weathered, but what she could read made her heart race. "I hear voices at night. They are here with me. I can't escape." "Hey, look at this," said Sarah, showing the diary to the others. The entries were getting more and more disturbing. "They want my soul. They're watching me through the windows. I did what they asked, but they never leave." "Is this some kind of joke?" asked Lucas, trying to hide the nervousness in his voice. But before anyone could answer, they heard a sound coming from upstairs. Slow, heavy footsteps echoing across the wooden ceiling of the hut. "We're not alone," whispered Emily, gripping Daniel's arm hard enough to leave marks. Armed only with a flashlight and forced courage, they decided to investigate the upper floor. The staircase creaked under their feet as they slowly climbed, each step increasing the tension in the already stifling air of the hut. When they reached the top, they found an empty room with an old bed and a broken window partially covered in ice. But there was something else, deep marks on the walls, as if claws had scratched the wood repeatedly. And on the floor, next to the bed, was a rusty axe, covered in dark stains that looked like dried blood. "What happened here?" asked Emily in an almost inaudible whisper. Suddenly, they heard a sound coming from downstairs, the cabin door opening slowly with an agonizing creak. "I closed that door," said Lucas with wide eyes. The group rushed down the stairs only to find the room empty, but now there were footprints in the snow coming through the open door, footprints too big to be human. Panic seized them as they realized they were trapped in there with something far beyond the natural. They tried to get out of the hut, but every time they opened the door they were confronted by an impenetrable darkness and a cold so intense that it seemed to want to swallow them alive. "We can't leave," said Sarah with tears in her eyes as she held the trembling diary in her hands. Hours passed like centuries as they tried to understand what was happening. Then the whispers began, indistinct voices coming from the walls of the hut. "They're here," said Daniel in a desperate tone. One by one, the friends began to disappear without explanation. First, Lucas was found dead in the kitchen with claw marks on his body. Then Emily disappeared while sleeping on the sofa, until only Sarah and Daniel remained. The next morning, when the storm finally ceased, local residents found the cottage empty, except for strange marks on the walls and dark stains on the floor. No one has ever known for sure what happened that night in the dark valley, but it is said that if you pass near the hut during a snowstorm, you can still hear the whispers of those who never managed to escape. 3. The Winter Ghost Train. It was a freezing January night, somewhere in remote Finland, where winter seemed eternal and darkness dominated the skies. Thomas, a lonely man who worked as a landscape photographer, was waiting at the small Kuusamo train station. He had missed the last train home due to an unexpected blizzard, and now he was stuck there, surrounded by an oppressive silence and the biting cold that seemed to want to freeze his soul. The station was deserted. The clock on the wall ticked midnight, but it seemed to have stopped a long time ago, as the hands didn't move. Thomas was rubbing his hands together trying to warm up when he heard a distant sound, the whistle of a train. He looked at the snow-covered tracks and saw lights slowly approaching through the darkness. An old train with dark wooden carriages and frost-blurred windows pulled up in front of him without making a sound. There was no one on the platform apart from him, and no voice announced the train's destination. The door of the nearest carriage opened with an agonizing creak. Against every instinct that told him to stay where he was, Thomas boarded the train, seeking refuge from the deadly cold outside. The inside of the carriage was just as cold as the outside. The lights flickered faintly, casting unsettling shadows on the wood-paneled walls. Thomas realized he wasn't alone. There were other passengers sitting quietly on the benches along the aisle. But something was wrong with them. Their skins were pale as wax, their eyes fixed on some distant point, and none of them seemed to be breathing or even blinking. He tried to greet a woman sitting by the window, but she didn't react. Her lips were parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Discomfort began to grow inside him as he made his way through the carriages. Each passenger he met seemed stranger than the last. Still, silent figures that looked more like statues than living people. When he reached the fourth carriage, he found something even more disturbing. A large mirror at the end of the corridor reflected everything around it, except himself. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized that something was deeply wrong with that train. "This is the Soul Train," said a gruff voice behind him. Thomas turned abruptly and saw an old man dressed in a weathered conductor's uniform. His eyes were deep-set and shone with a strange light. "Where are we going?" asked Thomas, trying to remain calm. "The final destination," replied the conductor enigmatically before disappearing into the darkness of the next wagon. Thomas began to feel increasingly panicky as he tried to find a way out. He ran to the nearest door and tried to open it, but it was firmly locked. Looking out of the frozen window, all he could see was endless snow covering a desolate landscape. No tracks, no trees, just endless white emptiness. The train began to accelerate, and the lights inside the carriages began to flicker violently. The pale figures on the seats began to move slowly, turning their heads towards him with stiff, unnatural movements. Their empty eyes were now fixed on him. "I don't belong here!" shouted Thomas as he tried to open another door. But then he saw something terrifying. His own reflection briefly appeared in the glass of the window. But it wasn't him. It was a distorted, cadaverous version of himself, with deep-set eyes and grey skin like the other passengers. Desperate, Thomas ran to the front of the train in the hope of finding the driver or any way of stopping this moving nightmare. When he reached the control cabin, he found it empty. The controls were covered in snow and ice, as if no one had touched them in decades. Suddenly the driver reappeared behind him. "You can't escape," he said calmly. "This train is for those who have already crossed the line between the living and the dead." "But I'm alive!" protested Thomas. The conductor merely smiled darkly before disappearing again. Thomas fell to his knees as the train continued its journey across the endless white expanse. He realized that there was no way out. He was trapped in that limbo between worlds. The next morning, when the storm ceased, railway workers found Thomas sitting alone on a bench at Kusamo station, frozen to death with an expression of sheer terror on his face. It is said that on nights of heavy snowfall, it is still possible to see the lights of that mysterious train crossing the frozen landscapes of Finland, but those who board never return to tell their story. 4. The Frozen Lake. It was a cold, silent night in the Swedish countryside, where winter seemed to turn everything into a crystal landscape. Lake Eldvatten, far from the small town of Kiruna, was known for its freezing beauty and its waters that became a mirror of ice during the harshest months of the year. Despite its serene appearance, the locals avoided the lake. There were old stories, whispers about tragedies and unexplained disappearances. But for Anna, a young skater determined to perfect her moves, these stories were nothing more than silly superstitions. Anna was 22 and dreamed of competing professionally. Skating had been her passion since childhood, and she believed that the isolation of Lake Eldvatten would be the perfect place to practice without distractions. That particularly frosty night, she decided to train alone. The full moon illuminated the landscape with a silvery glow, reflecting off the lake's snow and ice like a celestial mirror. It was an almost magical setting, or at least it seemed to be. With her skates on her feet and a heavy coat protecting her from the biting cold, Anna glided smoothly over the frozen surface. The wind whispered between the trees around the lake, but she was so focused on her movements that she barely noticed the eerie silence that enveloped the place. For a while, everything seemed perfect. She spun and glided with grace, feeling free and invincible. But then something interrupted her concentration, a muffled sound coming from beneath the ice. It was like a rhythmic beat, faint at first, but soon impossible to ignore. Anna stopped in the middle of the lake, panting, trying to identify the source of the sound. It must be the ice moving, she thought aloud, trying to convince herself that it was something natural. After all, frozen lakes sometimes made strange sounds due to the expansion and contraction of the ice. But the knocking continued, now stronger and closer. Anna felt a shiver run down her spine when she realized that it seemed to be coming from directly underneath her. Kneeling on the ice to investigate, she saw something that made her heart soar, indistinct shadows moving beneath the frozen surface. They looked like small hands pressing against the transparent ice, as if something or someone was trying to emerge from the depths. "This can't be real," muttered Anna as she slowly backed away. But then the knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. She lay still for a few seconds before hearing another sound, a faint whisper carried on the icy wind. "Come, play with us." Anna felt panic seize her body. She tried to run to the edge of the lake, but her skates slipped on the smooth ice, causing her to fall hard. When she looked back, she saw several pale, icy hands begin to emerge from the surface of the lake. The thin, translucent fingers clung to the ice like claws, trying to pull themselves out. She screamed for help, but her voice seemed to be swallowed up by the vastness of the night. The hands kept appearing, followed by pale faces and empty eyes that stared at her. They were children, or at least something that looked like children, with grim expressions and bodies deformed by the ice. Anna struggled to get up and skate towards the shore as the spectral figures began to crawl across the ice behind her. Their every move seemed slow and deliberate, but they were closing in fast. "Please, let me go!" she screamed in desperation. But the whispers continued, "Stay with us, forever." When she finally reached the shore of the lake, Anna looked back one last time. The figures had stopped at the edge of the ice, watching her with empty eyes glittering in the moonlight. Then they slowly disappeared into the frozen surface, as if they had never been there. When she got home that night, Anna was shivering, not only from the intense cold she still felt in her bones, but also from the terror that seemed to have seeped into her mind. She told her story to her mother, who turned pale as she heard the details. "Lake Eldvatn," her mother began hesitantly. "There's something you need to know." Anna listened intently as her mother explained the old stories about the lake. Stories she had always thought were just local legends to scare disobedient children. Decades ago, during a particularly harsh winter, a group of village children had gone to play on the frozen lake without adult supervision. The ice gave way under their feet as they ran and laughed carefree. None of them survived. Since then, the villagers believed that their souls had been trapped in the lake, condemned to wander under the ice until they found company to share their dark fate. "You were lucky," said her mother with watery eyes. "Many can't escape." Over the next few days, Anna tried to carry on with her life as normal, but something had changed inside her. At night, she dreamt of the children under the ice, their pale faces and hands outstretched towards her, as if begging for help or revenge. A week after that fateful night on the lake, Anna decided to return there during the day to face her fears and prove to herself that it was all just a hallucination caused by the extreme cold and loneliness. But when she arrived at Lake Eldvatn in the clear light of the winter sun, she found nothing but a perfectly smooth and silent surface of glistening ice. Yet, as he walked along the shore of the frozen lake, he swore he heard that familiar sound again, muffled thuds from the depths. And then came the whisper, "Come, play with us." Anna was never seen again after that day. The locals still avoid Lake Eldvatn to this day. They say that on the coldest nights you can hear children's laughter echoing through the wind, or see shadows moving under the ice in the light of the full moon. And those who dare to get too close can feel icy hands pulling them down, where lost souls wait patiently for eternal companionship in the cold darkness of the frozen lake's depths. 5. The creature of the eternal snow. The icy vastness of the Arctic was a place where silence reigned absolute, interrupted only by the sound of the biting wind and the occasional crackle of ice. It was in this inhospitable environment that a team of scientists embarked on an ambitious expedition to study the deep layers of ice and the secrets that might be hidden beneath them. Led by renowned glaciologist Dr. Erik Lindström, the group included experts in biology, geology, and climatology, all eager to unravel the mysteries of one of the most remote places on the planet. The expedition's base was set up in an isolated area in the north of Greenland, where temperatures dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. The main objective was to investigate anomalous formations detected by satellite, caves hidden under the millennia-old ice sheet. What they would find there was something none of them could have imagined. After days of careful drilling, the team finally made their way to an underground cavern. The entrance was narrow, but as they descended with flashlights and equipment, they discovered a vast and impressive space. The walls were made of crystalline ice that reflected light like a kaleidoscope, creating an almost unearthly beauty. However, the air inside was heavy, charged with an inexplicable feeling of discomfort. "This is incredible," said biologist Dr. Sophia Anderson as she examined the formations on the walls. "This place must be millions of years old." But there was something else in the cave. In the center of the main space, they found an unusual structure, a massive block of dark ice, unlike anything they had ever seen before. It seemed to pulsate slightly under the light of the lanterns, as if it had a life of its own. "Is it just a natural formation?" asked geologist Mark Evans hesitantly. "I'm not sure," replied Eric as he cautiously approached, "but we need to document it." While trying to collect samples of the dark ice, something happened. A deep sound echoed through the cave, a guttural noise that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The temperature dropped even further, and the lantern lights began to flicker. "Did anyone else hear that?" asked Sophia, her voice trembling. Before they could react, the block of ice began to crack. Cracks spread rapidly across the surface until it exploded into razor-sharp fragments. From within emerged something that seemed impossible, a creature made of compact snow and pure darkness. Its eyes glowed with a ghostly blue light, and its body seemed to mold itself continuously, as if it were part of the surrounding ice itself. Chaos overtook the cave. The creature advanced with frightening speed, its indistinct form moving like a living shadow across the frozen ground. Mark was the first to be taken. A short scream echoed before his body disappeared into the dark depths of the cave. "Run!" shouted Eric as he tried to guide the others to the exit. But escape wouldn't be so simple. The creature seemed to know every corner of the cave and pursued them relentlessly. Sophia stumbled as she ran and felt something cold grab her ankle. She screamed as she was dragged into the darkness, her colleagues powerless to help her. The remaining survivors, Eric, engineer Sam Carter, and climatologist Rachel Meyer, managed to reach the narrow entrance to the cave and temporarily block the way with heavy equipment. Gasping and terrified, they tried to process what had just happened. "What the hell was that?" asked Rachel with tears in her eyes. "I don't know," replied Eric, "but we can't let it get out of here." Trapped in the Arctic with limited supplies and deadly temperatures outside, the three knew they were in a race against time, both to survive and to prevent the creature from escaping to the surface. But the oppressive feeling of being watched never left them. During the following night, as they tried to rest in the makeshift base next to the cave, they heard sounds coming from outside. Cracks in the ice, and something scratching the outer walls of the structure. "It's here," whispered Sam as he held up a makeshift axe. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. In the absolute darkness, screams echoed through the base as the creature attacked again. When the lights came back on briefly due to the auxiliary generator, Eric saw Rachel being carried away by the monstrous shadow, her wide eyes frozen in sheer terror. Now, alone with Sam, Eric knew they had little chance of survival. They decided to return to the cave in the hope of finding some way to contain or destroy the creature before it could escape for good. As they returned to the place where it all began, they noticed something strange. Ancient inscriptions on the cave walls that they had ignored earlier in their haste. The symbols seemed to tell a story, a warning about an ancient entity trapped in the ice by civilizations long gone. "This isn't just a natural phenomenon," said Eric as he frantically examined the symbols. "This thing was sealed here for a reason." But before they could decipher any more details or formulate a plan, they felt that icy presence behind them again. Sam tried to fight with all his remaining strength, but it was no use. He disappeared in seconds into the creature's clutches. Eric ran desperately until he reached the deepest point of the cave, where he found something unexpected, a strange artifact buried in the ice, possibly part of the mechanism used to imprison the creature originally. With his last strength, and knowing there was no other way out, he activated the artifact without fully understanding how it worked. A burst of blue light filled the cave as he felt the extreme cold take hold of his body. Days later, when a rescue team arrived on the scene after losing contact with the original expedition, they found only absolute silence. The cave entrance was sealed again by thick layers of newly formed ice. But no one ever found any trace of the missing scientists. It is said that on the coldest nights in the Arctic, you can hear distant echoes coming from that remote region, guttural sounds mixed with the freezing wind, as if something is waiting patiently under the eternal ice to be awakened again. 6. The Hotel of White Silence. It was a harsh winter's night in Norway, with the wind howling like a lament and the snow falling incessantly. Lars, a lone traveler, was driving along a deserted road heading north. He was exhausted after hours behind the wheel, and the snowstorm made it impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. When he saw the lights of an isolated hotel by the side of the road, he felt an immediate sense of relief. He needed shelter, and this place seemed to be his only option. The hotel was an old building with white walls that almost camouflaged themselves in the snowy landscape. A rusty sign swayed in the wind, displaying the name Hotel White Silence. Lars parked the car and ran inside, shivering. The lobby was small and austere, but warmed by a crackling fireplace. Behind the counter, an elderly man with an expressionless face greeted him. "I need a room for tonight," said Lars, trying to sound casual. The receptionist nodded silently and handed him a key without asking any questions. No words were exchanged beyond that. Something about the man's behavior made him uncomfortable, but he was too tired to think much about it. As he went up to his room on the second floor, Lars noticed something peculiar. The corridors were strangely silent. There were no sounds of footsteps or voices coming from the other rooms. As he passed a few ajar doors, he saw figures sitting in chairs or lying on beds, as still as statues. They didn't look at him or react to his presence. In room 207, Lars found a simple bed and a window covered in ice. The silence was absolute, to the point where he could hear his own breathing echoing in the small space. Trying to shake off the growing discomfort, he threw himself on the bed and closed his eyes. But sleep didn't come. In the early hours of the morning, Lars was woken up by a distant sound, something like footsteps dragging in the corridor. He got up and opened the door to investigate. The corridor was empty, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Returning to the bedroom, he noticed something he hadn't noticed before. An old mirror hanging on the wall opposite the bed. In the mirror's reflection, he saw something that made his heart race. There was a figure standing behind him. He turned around quickly, but the room was empty. Convinced that it was just his mind playing tricks due to tiredness, Lars decided to explore the hotel to try and calm his nerves. He went back down to the lobby and found the receptionist still sitting at the counter, as still as before. "Is this place always so quiet?" asked Lars. The man looked up slowly and replied in a hoarse voice, "Everyone here prefers silence." Lars felt a shiver run down his spine. He looked around and saw other guests sitting in the armchairs near the fireplace. They were all motionless and avoided eye contact with him. It was as if they were shadows of people, physically present, but absent in spirit. Determined to get out of there in the morning, Lars went back to his room and tried to sleep again. But the sounds continued. Footsteps in the corridors, whispers coming from the walls, and muffled laughter that seemed to come out of nowhere. When it finally dawned, or at least when he thought it had, Lars went downstairs with his things ready to go. But something was wrong. The windows in the lobby were covered in a thick layer of ice that prevented any outside visibility. What's more, when he tried to open the hotel's main door, it wouldn't budge. "What's going on here?" she asked aloud. The receptionist just smiled enigmatically and pointed to a picture hanging on the wall behind him. It was an old photograph showing a group of people posing in front of the hotel. But among them was someone who appeared to be himself. Lars recoiled in shock as he tried to understand what it meant. It was then that he realized. He couldn't remember how he had arrived there the night before, or even concrete details about his trip before that. Desperate to get out of that hellish place, Lars ran through the corridors trying to find another way out. But the corridors seemed to change constantly. Doors appeared where there was nothing before. Stairs led to non-existent floors. As he ran aimlessly through the labyrinthine hotel, he began to see figures in the corners of his peripheral vision. The other guests, now staring directly at him with empty eyes and grim expressions. "You can't leave," said a female voice behind him. Lars turned to find a pale woman dressed in old clothes standing at the end of the corridor. "You already belong here," she continued before disappearing like smoke. Lars was never seen again outside the White Silence Hotel. It's said that those who pass the road during snowstorms can still see the lights of the hotel shining in the distance. But no one who enters ever returns. And if you listen carefully as you drive along those deserted roads during the harsh winter, you could swear you hear muffled laughter mixed with the icy wind, echoes of the souls trapped in the eternal silence of that cursed hotel. 7. The village buried in snow. In the remote mountains of Siberia, where winter never lets up and the snow piles up in eternal layers, a team of explorers was searching for a geological mystery. Led by archaeologist Dr. Viktor Ivanov, the group was equipped to face the most adverse conditions. For weeks, they had studied old maps and travelers' accounts that mentioned a lost village, buried under the snow and forgotten by time. For many, it was just a legend, but Victor believed there was something real hidden there. After days of hiking through mountains, covered in an endless white blanket, they finally spotted something unusual. Structures emerging from the snow. They were the roofs of old houses, visible only because a recent storm had exposed part of them. The village seemed frozen in time, each building covered in layers of ice that glistened in the dim light of the winter sun. "We did it," said Victor enthusiastically. "This is the village we've been looking for." The explorers began digging to make their way towards the houses. The silence was absolute, except for the sound of shovels cutting through the snow and the icy wind whistling between the mountains. When they finally managed to enter the first house, they found old furniture still in place, as if the inhabitants had left in a hurry. But something seemed wrong. There were no signs of life or bodies, just an unsettling emptiness. As they made their way through the village, they found more evidence that something sinister had happened there. In one of the larger houses, they discovered a locked chest. When they opened it, they found old diaries written in archaic Russian. Victor began translating the pages, while the others explored the surroundings. The accounts in the diaries were disturbing. They described how the villagers had faced a particularly cruel winter decades ago. The crops had failed, and hunger had gripped the community. In desperation, the village leaders decided to perform ancient rituals to invoke supernatural help. The pages spoke of chants performed under a full moon and sacrifices made on ice. "This is madness," said Victor as he read aloud to the others. They believed they could summon Chernobog, the Slavic god of darkness and chaos. "Does that explain why this village was abandoned?" asked Irina, one of the geologists in the group. "Maybe," replied Victor, but his expression showed growing concern. That night, while they were camping inside one of the houses to protect themselves from the extreme cold outside, they began to hear strange sounds. It was as if something was moving under the snow, heavy, dragging footsteps that echoed in the absolute silence. "It must be the wind," said Sergei, trying to calm them down. But then they heard a clearer sound, a low, guttural roar coming from the center of the village. Everyone ran out to investigate and found an opening in the ice that hadn't been there before, a deep hole that seemed to lead deep into the earth. "That wasn't here before," said Irina in a shaky voice. Victor looked at the hole with apprehension. If the diaries are right, maybe they've managed to summon something. While they were discussing what to do, the temperature dropped abruptly. The air around them seemed to freeze in their lungs with every breath. It was then that they saw it, a gigantic shadow slowly emerging from the hole in the ice. The creature seemed to be made of compact snow and pure darkness, with eyes glowing an intense red that cut through the surrounding darkness. "Run!" shouted Victor as everyone scattered in panic. The creature advanced with frightening speed, moving like a living avalanche. One of the explorers was caught immediately. His scream echoed through the village before being abruptly silenced. The survivors ran to the remaining houses in the hope of finding shelter or some way to escape, but it seemed that the village itself was against them. Doors wouldn't open, corridors led to dead ends, and the sound of the creature's heavy footsteps grew closer and closer. Inside one of the larger houses, Victor found more pages from old diaries scattered on the floor. One of them described how to seal the spirit if it was awakened. It was necessary to perform the ritual in reverse of the original one, but this would require courage and time that they clearly didn't have. "We have to try," said Victor to the few remaining survivors. With desperate haste, they began to prepare the ritual using the symbols described in the diaries and items found in the abandoned houses. Meanwhile, they could hear the creature prowling outside, its roars shaking the fragile walls of the buildings. Just as they began the final chant of the ritual, the creature burst through the front door of the house where they were hiding. It was huge and imposing. Its red eyes glowed with fury as it advanced slowly towards the group. "Keep going!" shouted Victor as he tried to distract the monster with a makeshift torch. The chant reached its climax when Irina uttered the final words described in the diary. A strong wind swept through the house as the creature let out a deafening roar before collapsing into a cloud of snow and darkness that disappeared into the freezing air. When it was all over, only Victor and Irina were left alive in the village, buried in the eternal snow. They knew they had to get out of there before anything else was awakened by the ancient forces of that cursed place. As they made their way back to the mountains, in absolute silence, carrying only their journals as proof of what they had faced, they both knew that they would never be able to tell the whole truth about what had happened in that time-forgotten village, because no one would believe them. And on the coldest nights of the Siberian winter, it is said that low roars can still be heard echoing through the mountains, as if something is waiting patiently for the right moment to awaken again. And those were the 7 horror stories involving cold, snow-covered nights. So, what did you think? Which one gave you the chills? Comment below. I'd love to know. If you liked the video, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow and brings you even more scary stories. Until next time, and watch out for the cold nights.